at ya, mad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, mad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, and I got the whole CTB crew with me. We got Wilford Riley, Christy Kelly, and Luke Perez. And joining us this week is Carlton Huffman. He is a recovering political advisor, as he says, and there's a lot of things that are of interest about him. But we brought him on to talk to kind of expand on what we've heard a lot about the alt-right and the woke right and Will is always educating me on these, trolls on the internet that have been festering this, increase of racism and racist talk on social media. And I've always said, that's just a couple crazy people. It's not really that bad. Those people aren't real. And Carlton's here to somewhat prove me wrong. So, Carlton, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here with you guys. Appreciate you having me.
Well, it's good to have you. So, it's not often we get to talk to somebody who's been in the dark circles. People always say, we had a guest on once. Will and Christy will remember. My good old buddy, I love the Christy wanted to strangle her, but Fatima Gilliam. And she wrote a book about, I forgot the exact title, forgive me, Fatima, but it was something about, what your black friends won't tell you. And so the whole point is she's a very fair-skinned black woman. And she was saying that in many circles, people couldn't tell she was black. They either thought she was white, or you kind of look at her like, well, she must be whatever. And so she would get to hear what white people really say. And so, many people don't really agree with her or didn't believe her. But here you have made it in and hopefully out the other end of the darkness. So talk about kind of your we can get to your transition, but what how you got sucked into some of the views and some of the groups, or just not even how yet, but just tell us what that kind of pertained in your situation, like what you were doing, what you were exposed to, and what your thoughts of the I don't know, is it alt right? What would you consider them? Tell you can describe them for me too.
Okay, yeah. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, born and raised in Western North Carolina in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and so I will sit here and say diversity was not much available in terms of coming up. So you weren't really exposed to multiple different people in that. It was a dominant culture that basically, centered around a certain type of whiteness. And when you grow up in it, you don't really have it challenged all that often. And so you think it's normal. And for me, it was just 20 some years removed from the height of the civil rights movement whenever I was born. And so you still had a lot of traditional views that were being held by a lot of people, including by people in my family. And so those views I did not consider quite malicious at the time, but I look back and can say they were definitely wrong. Got involved in history a lot, and in terms of wanting to preserve history, and unfortunately, for me, part of that history was what came to be almost a reverence for the Confederacy and the memory of the Civil War. And coming up in the late '80s, early '90s, there was, I would say, almost a backlash against efforts to malign the Confederacy. There was like a surge in interest in the Civil War. And for me, that seemed normal. That seemed like those views were seen as normal. And it wasn't really until I got to college, and it was like the mid 2000s, you started to see an opposite one that basically said that the Confederacy was rooted in racism, and the views of the Confederate flag and Confederate symbols were challenged vociferously so, and that was pretty much the root of what got me into the darkness. And my first boss in politics was God that a lot of people might not remember him much today, but Pat Buchanan. And Pat was one who took very much a similar traditional view of American history, and he was very good at being able to distill seemingly hard-edged ideas and make them comfortable for people, make them seem palatable, make them seem normal, when in reality you're swimming upstream against what is both right and just the way that things should be. and that was my like gateway drug into the darkness. And basically, not I never took what I would say was a malicious view in terms of wanting people to get hurt, but I definitely took a view that was demeaning of not of entire groups of people in a way that I regret it and will for the rest of my days.
Wow. That's a good ending, but I'll go to the group and say, who wants to take the first stab at asking the racist?
Well, I just had a question. I was wondering if the NFL team you're wearing, if that's the least racist NFL team. Like if you had to change, like your affiliation because of that. So
If I had to change it, I will sit there and say Tampa Bay. I definitely have an affinity for those folks, and just like I said, when you say least racist, I mean they definitely have a mix of all the cultures. If ever you go down to Tampa and Ybor City, and so if I had to switch, I would sit there and say Tampa would be my choice.
Carlson, let me ask you this question because I don't watch I told you whatever it said that's that's the direction we go. I don't watch the NFL anymore. Do you have a colored quarterback down in Carolina?
Yes, we have Bryce Young, which I'm a Georgia football fan, and he used to. I mean, he played for the University of Alabama, so he was not that high on my list during his college days. But before him, we had Cam Newton, who, like I said, he brought a lot of hope to the team before his injuries caught up with him. So I will sit there and say that the Panthers' former owner did get caught up in some of the same kind of stuff that I did. I mean, I can't remember how old he was before he passed, but he was well into his 80s, and he basically told Cam Newton whenever he came into the locker room, "Don't be getting any tattoos or just do anything too exotic," was the way Cam described it.
Gotcha. Will,
One
what would you?
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, it looks like we're all just moving around the panel. Like one question that I would ask Carlton is, I mean, there are obviously some football jokes I could make here. I mean, Cam Newton was very famous for dressing like Chicken George from Roots, if we're talking about this ethnically, with like the balloon pilot glasses and the cowboy hats and all this kind of stuff. But I've always liked chunks of Cam's career. But a serious question for Carlton would be, how would you define the alt-right, for example? I mean, you've mentioned like dark places, dissident right of Pat Buchanan, like a couple labels like that. What is that to you? Like how many people is that? Not names or anything, but like what are the core beliefs? Where are those people located? How would you break that down?
So there was a school of political thought that Pat belonged to called paleoconservatives, and these were folks that kind of challenged the William F. Buckley view of the world, which sought to sanitize conservatism, to take ideas of race out of the political discussion and make conservatism more colorblind, whereas the old right did not. I mean, they argued that those forces could not be ignored, that those were part of the conversation. And so you had those, that was the old version of it. But then as the online age came, you saw people who would basically try to just do things for shock value, but at the same time, they were rooted in some of like the darker impulses of what I would call right wing thought that basically sought to wish America back to a pre 1950s existence, maybe not saying that segregation needs to be the law of the land, but definitely that the predominant white culture was going to be the defining, I would say, force in American politics.
Yeah, if I could make one follow-up comment there, one thing that's always been kind of interesting about this to me is the idea that there's a coherent single thing called white, and it's that, not American culture, that unifies the USA. So, like by this perspective, when I've debated intelligent alt-righters online, just both of us was bullshitting, their idea seems to be that Italians, Irishmen, Turks, Jews, well, maybe not anymore, but like all of these groups together are just one thing, and then myself and Lou and Charles and Christy, who are obviously just normal, successful business people and media types, are something completely different, and we can't understand each other. And there's a lot of like 1980s era IQ data that's used and so on. And this to me, having played some sports and so on, always seems, as I assume almost all of you have, it's always seemed kind of nonsensical, like visibly untrue. But I mean that this is more a comment than a question. That was one of the things I saw there, that there's a unified white culture, and that's what American culture is. And I guess maybe as one more follow-up, what are the idea? What's a unified white culture supposed to be? Like, what do a Jewish guy and a Muslim guy have in common?
Well,
Or Jewish guy and a Christian guy?
I mean, it's pretty much. I mean, as I've heard it explained, and definitely having read it through like Pat Flynn's and others, it is the predominant culture that emerged in Europe, beginning with Western civilization emerging in Greece, and then through the Roman Republic. Those ideals that did not really take into account any of the other cultures of the world, and it got distilled down into what we at least thought was democracy, the ideas of the Enlightenment, and we saw that those ideals were uniquely European. And while obviously there's a great amount of diversity in European thought and European identity, once they came to America, those distinctions, while they remained in part, were largely subsumed into a unifying culture defined by the final product of those ideas emerging into a cohesive political and cultural identity.
Chrissy.
Yeah, I guess you talked about the Confederacy and having an affinity towards it, but like everything we hear about it is, it's culture, it's, part of just having a reverence for, the forefathers or whatever that fought in the Confederacy. So is that a lie that people tell to make it more like, acceptable? Is it really about racism, or is it really just about culture, or is it a mix?
It's definitely a mix. And so, just to give you a personal background of mine, and I would say too, that was like a defining part of at least up until recent years in North Carolina. I mean, that reverence for the Confederacy was real. You went before it was taken down in 2020. The largest statue on the Capitol grounds was dedicated to the Confederacy. There were multiple monuments dedicated to the Confederacy. And there was a motto called First at Bethel, furthest at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, and last at Appomattox. And just a quick Cliff's Notes of history. First at Bethel, the first Confederate soldier that was killed in action was from North Carolina. And furthest at Gettysburg and Chickamauga were the Confederate units that penetrated the furthest at the last big Confederate battles were from North Carolina. And the last group of soldiers to surrender with Robert E. Lee at Appomattox were from North Carolina. And the thing I can sit there and say from my personal perspective is that two of those things touched on my family directly. I had ancestors at both Appomattox and at Gettysburg and Chickamauga. And so for me, it was a family thing, as I've heard it say among Black folk, for the ancestors. And so for me, it started out as honoring my ancestors as part of their fight and their sacrifice. But one thing that I wish I had been taught in history class, because the great lie that we would tell ourselves that is that the war was not actually about slavery, and that people would get in shouting matches with you if you attempted to tell them that. But one thing that I was never taught in history class was the cornerstone speech, which was given by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and he just basically said, slavery and white supremacy is the cornerstone upon which this new country is being built. And we hold that the Negro is not equal to the white man in any way, shape, or form. If we had been taught that at a younger age, I can't say that I would not have fully accepted it at that time, but I can definitely say I could not have argued with the contention. And so the entire identity as far as the Confederacy and how it drills down to modern day political thought and how it impacts culture is that for so many people, it is a symbol of defiance at a modernization of culture. But for really many people, it does boil down to the fact that they thought that the wrong side won the Civil War and that the country is the worse off for it.
Right. Well, as the social scientist here,
Okay.
the politics and the history,
Mm-hmm.
not to give them a pass, but that outside of this is the cornerstone of this new country, that line of thought about differences of the Negro was not unique to Confederates, right?
No, absolutely not. I think Martin Luther King said that whenever he went to Chicago after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, I mean, he had literal Nazis protesting him, and he said that the hatred that he witnessed in Chicago was as bad as anything he ever saw in Mississippi.
Just step on over the black man. Don't let him speak, Carlton. That's fine. I was talking to Will.
Racism. But anyway,
Mea culpa.
yeah, I think there are a couple different things going on there. I mean, so first of all, like a lot of the Confederate admiration in the South today, and I mean, I'm of Irish and free/slave black descent. Like a lot of my ancestors in the first two groups fought the Confederacy. So I mean, there's not really a sense of love or romance there at all. But the Confederacy, obviously, living in Kentucky, is to some extent just a symbol of Southern regional pride today. Like, I don't think most people are aware of the exact historical details of what their ancestors did. Like, I think if you took a Hotep black man and you set him down and you talked about the Ashanti and said, you know, these people had a high medieval level of technology, they had knights, they were some of the greatest slave traders in history. You know, the whites didn't even want to go inland and fight them so they could take their slaves right down to the dock, all their slaves. I think that person would be absolutely shocked. Like, and they'd have to do a little more reading to realize what was going on in Africa at the time. Similarly, the Confederacy right now, if you see a Confederate flag on some old boy's truck, he's watching a high school football game, I don't really think that means a lot in terms of racial attitudes at the time. So at the time, of course, people say the Civil War was about states' rights, and there's the famous goose meme on like Twitter and Facebook, like a state's right to do what? SOB. Like, yeah, of course, slavery played a huge role in that. Yeah, I think that's undisputed, but one, I'm not sure that that's what's remembered today when people think about the courage of Lee's boys or something. I think it's fair to note that. And two, yeah, as you and Carlton both noted, that was not unique to the Confederacy at the time. In fact, I would say that every world leader at the time, from the Mansas and Shakas in Africa over to the white lords in Europe and the New World, was a racist. Everyone wanted to advance their population group, their people group versus their enemies. If you were captured in war, you were very likely going to improve the agricultural productivity of wherever you were shipped to. So, I mean, Abe Lincoln said things like, I would have, if the Union could have been saved without freeing a single slave, I would not have freed a single slave. So, yeah, Confederacy basically bad, but everyone at that time, again, from Abe Lincoln to Shaka Zulu, was bad by our standards. And we'd be bad by theirs, by the way. All of those people would have been completely baffled by the level of OnlyFans prostitution, by the sun bomb nuclear weapons, by factory farming of highly intelligent animals. So I'm going to leave it there. But yeah, complex picture. Confed's not good, but no one had modern attitudes.
Right, right. Does anybody else have anything to say about that before I ask Carlton my next question?
Okay.
Well,
Or could I?
Colin, I just want to say something. So, oftentimes I'm a northerner. I'm from New York, so I guess growing up, like I not that I look for any opportunity to shit on the South because it's not like that, but this one thing in particular, it's always been, I guess, a little tough for me to wrap my head around. Where it's like the pride of the Confederacy, but I think you guys are doing a good job, explaining it. And what I find interesting is that in a lot of when it comes to other wars, uh, uh, especially from like the anti-war side, they talk about how the conscripts are often kind of lured into fighting for the interests of others, the interests of the wealthy or the people who are going to make money off of this. And we often hear about like, the very low percentage of people in the South who actually own slaves. So, part of me, like just thinking of this, I'm just sort of like, it's like when so few people had the power in the South and owned slaves, it's like, how do you mobilize all of these men to basically fight, for that institution that they don't necessarily, benefit from? You know what I mean?
I mean, I can speak to that from a historical perspective. I mean, for so many years, I mean, it was also my thought about it is that North Carolina, we did not secede from the Union until after the firing on Fort Sumter. So that was kind of our caveat to saying, well, we didn't secede with the rest of the Deep South slave states. We only got into it whenever Abraham Lincoln said that you are going to send troops into the South to put down the rebellion. And it was seen as an outside force coming onto our turf. And that was a unifying force for folks, even if they did not own slaves. But one thing I would also just say for those who did not have slaves, they still benefited from it. They still benefited from that whole system. Like most of the money, most of the wealth in the South came from the institution of slavery, and that filtered through all aspects of society. And it's something that we look at Mississippi nowadays is considered one of the poorest states in the country. Back in 1861, Natchez, Mississippi had the richest zip code in America. And the two wealthiest states in the country were Virginia and South Carolina. and that was basically the entire economy revolved around the system, whether somebody actually owned a slave or not.
Mm-hmm. Nope, good. Let me ask you this though, Carlton. You talk about you gave a good description of what the mindset is, but tell us we haven't gotten into that, like how you kind of got pulled into it.
I would say, I mean, I mentioned like around the middle of my college tenure, you started to see conversations regarding race really take a center stage in the United States, particularly with Hurricane Katrina taking whenever that occurred. The what was seen as the disparate response by the federal government to a national tragedy. And it was seen that, I mean, Kanye West said it at the time, George Bush didn't care about black people. And those issues basically were seen through a racial lens. And you started to see also, too, these incidents involving law enforcement and young black men. They really started to escalate, or at least attention on them began to escalate at that time. And so combined with like race seemed to be at the center of everything, you started to see conversations about law enforcement and its relationship with the public. And as a conservative or definitely right wing person of that at that time, you want to defend the institutions. You sit there and say, no, race had nothing to do with the response to Hurricane Katrina, and a police officer is just doing his job. If the citizen just obeyed, they would not have any problem with law enforcement at that point. And then you started to see also commentators like Roland Martin, Al Sharpton, and others really start to take aim at Confederate symbolism and saying we need to remove these symbols from the public square. And that, for me, I mean, that triggered a response in my mind right there. It's like, okay, these things have been around as long as I've been alive and before I was even alive. And the voices that were seeking to challenge both those views and actually take physical action regarding the symbols, they all happen to be black. And that triggered something in my mind to sit there and say, like, whoa, that to me is wrong. And that's whenever you had people like Pat Buchanan, before I worked for him, I followed him adamantly, and he provided, I think we spoke about it on the phone, he provided the permission structure in my mind to sit there and say, no, they're not right, I am. And that started to suck me into looking around for people of similar views. And that's how I really got drawn in.
Yeah, kind of put yourself in a bubble. And I hate to be that guy again. I'm sure that's going to keep happening. Everyone's going to get mad at me and saying I'm a white supremacist sympathizer. But at some point, you just got to be honest. So you mentioned the time frame of when this happened, and any one of you can comment on and or correct me. But you were talking about the news of the day at the time, and you mentioned Katrina and said Kanye West and race had nothing to do with it, is what the people in your circle were saying. But all the people on the TV were talking about, George Bush didn't care about black people. He left them out there. He caused them to die. It was intentional, all this other stuff. But that's not really what happened. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that that's not, in fact, people that pay attention, like Will and Christy, may know, but I don't think most people know now. I mean, I'm assuming they didn't scrub it from the internet, that no less than Donna Brazile, whose family was in New Orleans, who's the CNN anchor, the one who gave Hillary Clinton the questions in 2016, who was black, 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 and hated Republicans, said that she was amazed at how much George Bush did for New Orleans. And she wrote this whole, wonderful, long, beautiful thing about what was done for her family and her neighborhood and all those kind of things. And, you just don't really hear that. So, I mean, mistakes were clearly made, but and obviously I'm not siding with the white supremacists, and they shouldn't always, believe the system and blame the blacks. But things are simply more nuanced than they are. And so while you and the group you were with went in one direction and kind of made assumptions negatively about blacks, at the same time, you were in real time watching people get on TV and lie.
And I can say too, also, I mean, some of the comments that were made, not just by Kanye West at the time, but I mean, you saw, and I mean, and it was sensationalized in part because of the fog of war, I mean, in communication on the ground. But there were reports of National Guard and police helicopters getting shot at, The police deserted. You had the mayor of the city at the time try to cover for his lack of response in terms of getting people out of the city in a timely manner by
Flooded buses.
lashing out and using racial overtones in his language. And then whenever he won his reelection after that, he said that New Orleans needed to be a chocolate city. And just like I said, white person, we're just sitting there, we hear that, we're like, whoa, what if we said that? Which
Didn't Ray Nagin go to jail, Will?
Well, I think he went to jail Illinois governor style, right? Like he did a couple months, maybe a
Which
year.
one? We had three of our governors go to jail. Which one you talking about?
Actually, I have a funny joke about that. Yeah, there were three of them in a row. There's so much humor there. Like, don't they know someone's listening by now? But a very brief story. I was at Southern Illinois University for my buddy's PhD graduation. He'd been in my form. And the person they had speak, it was either Governor Blagojevich or Governor Pashar, and I think both of them went to jail. And
Wow.
we were all like, "Oh, the governor's talking. This is so cool. This is nice for the young kids," because we weren't trying to emphasize all the negative on this day. And the woman in front of me, this great old Southern lady, turned around and goes, "The governor's talking. Is he out?" Like it wasn't a joke at all. It was just like your last three governors have gone to prison. But anyway, I do think there's one important point that Carlton just made that I'm going to shut up. But obviously, if you're just a normal working class or political consulting type white dude in the South, sports fan, regular guy, and you constantly hear racism from the left, one possible outcome, if you're not a pussy, is going to be racism from the right. And this is something that we have to be kind of honest about. Like there were years of just this crazy stuff. Like there are two golden bronze, one gilded, one. Don't want to exaggerate. They're two gold-looking statues of George Floyd. They're both about 9 feet tall in major cities right now. So obviously, a lot of people are going to look at that and say, you know, my grandfather was a World War II veteran. My father was a Vietnam or Iraq War veteran. They both worked their whole life. They died. They weren't buried in gold caskets. What the hell's going on here? And that's one of the things that contributed to racism in recent years. Like it's crazy to deny that. You've seen it skyrocket among whites and blacks.
This is a perfect segue, Christy. I have a question for you. I know you read the article, so I don't think I mentioned it. That's my fault in the setup. So, Carl, we'll get into what happened. But Carlton was canceled and fired from a job, which I'm totally against. Not that I'm again defending what he may have said in the post. I didn't read them all, but it's insane the amount of time. We're not talking 3 or 4 years. This was more than a decade ago. I'm like, who's getting fired for stuff they said when they were in it? Like he said, he was around Carlson. But in that, Christy, to Will's point, a lot of the things I'm reading it, and I just don't get. There's no shock value for me. I don't get offended by stuff, right? I cannot agree with it. I'm like, okay, that's. I see some people post stuff on the internet as racist. I'm like, oh, that's stupid, and then I don't get upset about it. But his was unique. I don't know if this was all of it, but I'm reading the article and it's kind of a hit piece and talking about these are the things he was condoning. I'm like, if I just make him black, this is no different than everything else I hear. I mean, it's like we need to have more babies because the minorities are growing in their percentage, so we need more white people. How's that different from black people saying we need more, we need to, more of our group or whatever else, or saying we need to stick with our kind. We need, they say, like ethnocentric group and they term it differently, but it's just like like I literally Umar Johnson going around talking about, oh, you dating snow bunnies. It's literally the same thing. So what's the difference, Christy?
I mean, I guess I have one train of thought is that's why I don't really get that mad at racists per se, because if you talk to any black man, especially 70, 80 years
uh,
old, yeah, I mean, they're really some of the most racist people, they're just like, the stuff that goes on in black households that's said, just, jokingly or just very matter of factly. It
mm,
is very racy.
mm,
But the common thing is we haven't had the power to be racist. Not saying that, that's an argument that we haven't been in positions of power
mm,
for our racism to even matter. Now, I'm not saying
mm,
I agree with that, but I
mm,
get it.
mm.
But if I
Oh,
can
I'm
kind of
sorry, I'm making
if
sour.
I can kind of pivot for a little bit, if I can say growing up in a black household, definitely. I mean, there were, sensitivities as far as, things said. So I'm wondering, was that the same for you, Carlton? It's like my part A, where because I hear you say Pat Buchanan kind of gave you the permission. Or I read something with like the Souls to the Polls episode, and you were kind of depressing, the turnout or something like that. And it was that campaign that kind of gave you that apparatus. But how much of that is, no, I was racist point blank because of me. That's what and I like Carlton. I've written an article of
He's
Carlton.
one
I
of
knew
my
him
favorite
before this.
racists.
I'm gonna like him after this, but that's part of what I'm hearing is how much of it is, no, it was just in me to be a little racy, and I was a little racy.
Racy.
I mean, I would sit there and say, I mean, I own and take accountability for everything that I said. And I know, and like I said, I mean, there was a lot that went into creating those attitudes that was environmental and outside of me, but in terms of taking it into action, my anger and then the resentment that manifested was mostly in response to what I saw as attacks on things that I had grown up with and were part of the tradition that I grew up with, and that led me to adapt or adopt attitudes that were wrong. I would sit there and say, though, I mean, you mentioned like in households, and this is me, like I said, just being vulnerable. It's like I did not hear the N word from outside of anybody. I heard it within the family. Was whenever I first heard it, but it was kind of amusing to me in the sense that the family member who said it to me, even though it was just us, said it in a whisper, and I just sitting there like, okay, why are they whispering? It's like if it's just us, and why are they whispering?
Hmm.
So, I mean, it was not something that I heard prolifically, but both the language and the words along with it were something that I would not say, like I said, not prolific, but not uncommon. And so I think that went to planting certain seeds that sprouted later. But
Yeah.
as they sprouted, that was me. Those were my attitudes, and I have to take accountability for them.
So what were the
And
things you said? Oh, go ahead, Chrissy.
I guess my part B is, so you didn't necessarily come out to the world and confess, this. Like you kind of disavowed it, and then it was brought up again, in this hit piece on you. We've seen
13 years
white,
later.
yeah, 13 years later, we've seen white people do crazy stuff to make amends. I mean, we saw during George Floyd, them with the kente cloths and taking the knee and just
Washing
doing
feet.
really,
Don't forget about washing feet. One of my
just
favorites.
doing really like cringe stuff. Do you ever feel the need to make amends?
Say like when it comes to making amends, it's doing the right thing. I mean, having conversations like this and hopefully people learning from them. I mean, part of it was whenever I was married and with my stepson, it was raising him to be a good human. It was basically whenever kids these days, they love hopping on the internet and they have their chats and they're basically attached to the world. And it's like at one point, whenever he heard something that was of a racial nature, I just pulled him aside and just said, do not ever say anything like that or even think like that. And so for me, it was just trying to be a good human and also to seeking out community. And it would just be whenever I would be traveling for political work, if I was going to a church, I try to go to a black church just because I enjoy the worship experience, but also to just trying to build community. And that is something that I continue to do. I am not going to be somebody who is going to shout like a social justice warrior or sit there and renounce the color of my skin. It's just sit there and say, I was wrong. I realize I was wrong. I'm going to try to be the best person. Whenever I see something that is wrong involving something like what we saw when we've seen like Walter Scott or Eric Garner, when we see the police do something that is obviously wrong, I am going to say that it is wrong and not take up for them or just retreat into the racial corners that a lot of times we just see us do whenever these high profile incidents come up. But like I said, that if there's any kind of penance, it is that. It is not going to be me sitting here and just renouncing my entire identity and trying to reinvent myself, because that would be inauthentic and it would just be, like I said, for other people's opinion of me, not how I saw myself.
Mhm.
Yeah, the other thing with a lot of social justice stuff is that it's just totally performative. I mean,
Right.
so like we talked about slavery in Africa and Arabia, like the kente cloth the congressmen were wearing was from the tribe I mentioned that were like the most legendary slave traders in the world. So it's just this narrow sort of attempt to look good. It never makes any sense. I mean, even the cases that were chosen for BLM, like I agree with you on Walter Scott, that's a tragedy. Um, Eric Garner, was that the 500-pound guy who was illegally selling cigarettes and had a heart attack with his
Thank you
gun
for
on him?
saving me. Thank you for
Yeah,
saving me,
like, I mean,
because
like,
He
I
was
didn't know
selling
he was a bad
Lucy's.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
of course you shouldn't die, but what happened was that a guy whose entire job, I think he was also a CD bootlegger, was crime. He was out there with his pistol. The cops get called. He gets in a fight with the cop and he has a heart attack. Like, put the cop on desk duty for a couple of years. But every one of those BLM cases, almost all of them collapsed. Like, I looked at them for a book and there were like two innocent brothers that were killed. And one of them was Tamir Rice, who was 12. And even he had a gun. But he had like a BB gun. He was like playing with other kids. But almost none of them were just an innocent black man walking home from hoops practice or church who was murdered by the police. Just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I love the fact that Will's my co-host, so I don't always have to be the bad guy. Because I was going to say, my friend, I got a guy who's pro cop, right?
Well,
Black guy, but he was like, even that one, you can't give me that one, child. Eric Garner is the one. 100% cops wrong, whatever. I said, go watch the video and tell me what he said before it happened. It's like, all right, fine. He's like, you're right. I said, what did he say? Like, I said, no, quote what he said. He said, this ends today. That's what Eric Gardner said, not the cop. I'm not going. This ends today.
If
What are
I
they supposed to do? I'm trying to arrest you. You're like, nope, I'm not going.
I mean, for me, I do have a libertarian streak when it comes to authority right there. So for me, it's like, as someone who comes from the hills of Appalachia, moonshine is a big thing. And that was just, for me, like selling cigarettes, he didn't need to die on account of that. That's
They have a higher crime rate in Appalachia than the black community. Like, I live in Appalachia. I mean, those guys get shot by the cops all the time
Right,
because
and
they're felons.
and he could have just gone to jail for his 362nd time and got out the next day like he always does.
well, I think too, and as a I'm another libertarian here. Something that I've had to contend with, like especially even if you look at that example of like the Eric Garner, I mean he was doing it outside of another person's store.
That's not a God thing,
right?
yeah.
So like in my libertarian world, the owner would have come out with a bat and probably broke him down in a different
chased him away.
without even getting the cops involved. So either way, the dude fucked up multiple times throughout his life, and that would have been probably another example of it.
Look, Carlton, I was going to ask.
Point
Oh,
from
go ahead,
Lou,
Will.
but it's funny to me that the solution for intelligent male libertarians is always like a lynch mob. Like, and I don't mean to like put it in that light, but it's like,
Oh, they're the
I mean, it usually just kind of does the job.
boys and come out with the bats. Like, I
They
think
don't
that's
like
why we
aggression,
have
Will.
cops, so that people don't do that.
Nobody plays sports anymore, so that's why you get fewer and fewer baseball bats.
There you
A
go.
bunch of punks.
So that's
Yeah.
why they had to call the cops. Carlton, I still don't know what you said. What did you say that got you fired?
Oh,
I mean, it was a litany of comments.
Give me the worst one. I can brace myself. You probably don't want to repeat it. What was the worst one?
I mean, I'm sitting there like I'm going back through. I know I made fun of black elected officials, like saying that like.
Oh, who doesn't do that?
What's that?
I'm sorry. Go on. I said, who doesn't do that?
I made the point that I thought that black elected officials in a number of cases were popped for corruption, but they were defended in like Bill Patrick up there in Detroit. That
No, he went to prison. So far, you safe. What else you got?
I sat there and said that Western civilization had a place of prominence that placed it above others.
Okay, what else? I'm trying to find a reason to get you fired. And I'm going to give them a 13-year pass. I'm going to act like you said it yesterday. What else you got? No N-word? You didn't say nigger?
Glorifying the Confederacy.
Did you call somebody a nigger, Carlton?
What's that?
Did you call somebody a nigger?
No.
Okay, didn't say nigger. I'm taking notes. So he didn't say nigger.
well,
Try to cleanse anybody, any ethnic cleansing of the Jews or the blacks. No ethnic cleansing. Okay. I got nothing, Christy.
Colton, I had to go through the same list, the same checklist when I was on my first time here. I just have a question. So, having read like Will's work for years and following Charles and stuff, and now knowing Christy and her work, what I'm wondering is where you started of basically kind of countering the history or propaganda that was given towards you about the state of America, systemic racism and stuff like that. And I think, as Will said, when you're experiencing racism from one side, it seems like a natural move to counter it with your own. Are you at a point where you sort of look and say, like, oh, actually, you know what? renouncing the the racism of the past, but looking now and like, hey, you know what? The United States isn't actually as racist as one would think. That like, have you come out and like look back and like, oh wow, we actually live in a pretty pluralistic society where a lot of maybe there's too much emphasis on racism that isn't actually there.
I mean, I've always sat there and said, and I will maintain it. I mean, the United States is the greatest country that has existed in the history of man. I do believe that we have had wrongs. Definitely, what was done to the Indians, you just, like I said, can't say much else about that. And I would definitely say having the system of slavery and then 100+ years of Jim Crow, or 100 years of Jim Crow after the fact, was a grievous wrong, and definitely the redlining and things that folks had to go through even after Jim Crow was over with. But the same thing is that we are a country that was able to self-correct. That we did have heroes that stood up and they were able to appeal to the conscience of the majority of the country, and we were able to correct the worst of the wrongs. There's still stuff to be done in terms of economic progress and historical redressing of wrongs, but I would still sit there and say that I mean, and maybe, like I said, it's a little bit of a self-portrait of myself. I mean, do I look at myself and say that, yes, I was wrong and I have done wrong, but at the same time, I'm trying to come out on the other side and do the right thing. And I kind of view the country as doing much the same, that once the wrongs were pointed out in such a way that you just cannot ignore it, that the country ended up doing the right thing.
Well, Carlton, to that, you talk about doing wrong. In our conversation, in talking about coming on the show, you did mention that you've experienced. I started off by talking about our lovely former guest Fatima being that fly on the wall. You said that being in some of these spaces, you did experience some unsettling things. So talk a bit about, feel free to drop names, but talk a bit about the negativity that you've seen in your political career and in those circles.
I mean, the biggest thing, and I mean, I will sit here and say he is the most immediate former governor of Wisconsin. He at one time, while we were talking about the election in North Carolina in 2016, we talked about black turnout being down, and he just said just one word, good. And other comments like that were, I mean, not uncommon. I know there was one guy. He is currently on the board of elect. I mean, it's trying to remember the exact name for the institution, but they oversee elections in Wisconsin. He is a member of the state Republican Party executive committee up there. He made a point. I don't know if he thought he was comfortable around me because I was a Southerner, but he's like, yeah, I've got most of my fried chicken places are in the north side of Milwaukee, and you know who lives there. Like, comments like that, and also to just, I mean, you mentioned the Souls to the Polls episode, or that was mentioned earlier. The comments about that and just wanting to have a wet blanket thrown over black turnout in certain precincts. Those were the biggest things, like where maybe it was not seen as like malicious or racist, but definitely wanting to like assuming that these folks are going to vote this way, therefore it's better for us if they don't vote.
Chrissy is going to be upset at me and say I'm wrong. But my one word response to that is, duh. Obviously, if you're a Republican running for statewide office in the areas that are majority black and they go 90% for the Democrat, you want them to stay home? How the hell is that racist? Oh, I'm sorry. We're not recording, right? This is pre-tape. But I wanted something that we should go. What, Will? Go ahead.
But what's interesting because it's like those debates on social media between couples that are failing and everything. Like we don't talk or sleep together anymore, and we're gaining weight. Like I've posted a couple of those threads and said, this is the solution, blah blah blah. Usually from the men's perspective, but I mean, in reality, like either person could solve the problem at any time. But in practical reality, you need kind of like a step matches step approach. So, like, black people think the GOP is racist, frankly. I don't think that's fair. I think the Democrats, in terms of prejudice against, say, whites or both men and women in weird ways with trans stuff, even their assumptions about whether black kids can read, they probably have more actual bigots on the team.
Our
But I mean,
literal governor in New York just said 3 days ago that black people don't have computers. They don't even know the word
yeah,
computer. The
Yeah,
New
we hear
York
that.
State
The
governor
Democrats say
said
that.
that.
The Democrats say that kind of crap all the time, like expecting your child to nap is white supremacy, just like the craziest shit. Yes, I get that. I agree with you, Charles. But I mean, nonetheless, like when you log on to the internet, when you're on Facebook or Twitter, or Instagram, and you see like pages with names like niggers taking L's, excuse me, like that, those are
Right.
generally going to be hosted from the right. You're going to see the Confederate flags and all that. So I think
Right.
that's the perception among kind of the black business community, which would be inclined toward the GOP. Like Trump got well over 20% of young black men, almost half of young upper middle class black men when you really see that data parsed out. But I mean, a lot of those people just stay home. They think it's a race between two bad options. So that's the black side. And the GOP side is, well, like everybody in those communities hates us. That's the perception.
Right.
You know, we're only going to get 20%. Why the hell would we bother?
Right.
And so you just stay at 20%. It's like the couple that no longer goes on dates because he knows she hates him and she knows he hates her. I mean, the Republicans at some point do have to go into these communities and get that up to 35%. Then you'll see more turnout and get that up to 40%. The question is, are you going to do that? And it might take some wealthy black person to fund it. You keep hearing like 50 Cent, all these guys move to the right. Like the GOP is not going to put that money in and just lose it. Someone might have to put it up and start backing candidates, which is how you started getting Republicans in the white South, by the way. Like that was a shift after the civil rights movement, then after the Dems moved on abortion, et cetera.
Right, right. And you said it better because I wasn't saying that it made sense. It's a bad play. It just made I just understand it is all I'm saying, right?
And amorally logical would get.
Yeah, but you're never going to gain that way. But if you're looking at immediate this race and I want to win it, where do I put this pot of money? That's not where you're going to put the pot of money. And then when you put the money into another pot, now you're begging like so Will and I are from Illinois. And so when everybody knows this is a perfect example of both sides. They can rarely do it, but everybody on both sides of the political aisle in Illinois knows that there's 102 counties and 90 plus of them are GOP. It's a little less, but when I was there, it was 99. There's a Republican who won 99 of 102 counties and he lost the election. Everybody knew if you can get 20% of Cook County or more as a GOP candidate, the Democrat would never win. All you needed was the 20 was the benchmark. Every once in a while they got it, sometimes they didn't. But the odd thing is they never tried to get 30, like Will said. It was always like, hey, let's try to get 20%. Why? Why don't you just try to get all the votes and see how many you actually get? Right. So
Well,
I don't think it's a smart strategy. I'm just saying I wouldn't on its face call it racist to do it. Because if I've already spent this time in the elections 3 months now and I didn't put the money in, which was a bad move, and I didn't go out and ask for their vote, bad move. Now the only thing I can count on is that they stay home. So that's why I feel like you got good. That's all I'm saying. It's
you
stupid.
also have candidates. Like I actually think almost everyone on the panel, possibly including Carlton, could go to the hood and pitch for votes and just like I mean I'd have fun doing it. I'd lose, but I mean you'd be able to bring out the GOP ticket a little bit. And I mean I've gone to a lot of those neighborhoods just to give speeches in Chicago and Louisville. Like I'll talk to black audiences, that kind of thing. Charles, I know you do that. You're on the New York School Board, but how many Republican, Black, or Hispanic guys or women are there that can plausibly go into a working class neighborhood and not put on kind of a clown show?
Right.
Like this is a point Shamika used to make all the time about sort of Black conservatism. A
Right.
lot of it is tailored to appeal to high dollar white audiences. And
Right.
they're not really an issue, get your hustle on, but like, is that going to work if you're actually in Brooklyn and you're talking about these mundane quality of life issues? Like, how are you going to fix the sewers? That sort of stuff. So there are two strikes right from the start.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And unfortunately, no one's really figured out the playbook except for Trump, but he's an anomaly, so you can't really use his playbook. His playbook only works for him. Um, the
I hate to keep jumping in. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure being cocky, funny, not racist, and wearing a suit only would work for Trump.
well, that's
Like
true.
when I poll black men, they just say he talked like a normal guy.
That's
There
true.
was none of this
Mm.
apology, but he wasn't racist. He said he wanted some black interns. He came and pitched my college or whatever. Like there was none of the nonsense. He just talked like he would to a white audience.
Yeah.
And I can point to one other person too. I think is an example, and that's Brian Kemp in Georgia. I mean, the fact was he ran against a black female and Stacey Abrams of a have opinions about how she presented herself in that election, especially the not conceding the loss in 2018 part. But I mean, Kemp made a candid effort to go to people like Killer Mike and I mean, was able to overperform in the inner city of Atlanta and in definitely the more diverse Atlanta suburbs. So him and Tim Scott, I mean, I think are just great examples. I mean, one
Ron
being a black man.
DeSantis.
I would say DeSantis would be another one too. I mean, I would say with DeSantis, I mean, the fact that you appoint a former Republican turned independent, turned Democrat, and Charlie Crist, who was on every side of every issue, was a big part of
Yeah,
DeSantis'
that's
success.
true. The
Also,
bad candidate. But Christy, you were nodding hard. You don't think DeSantis got a good percentage of the black vote in Florida? Did you not see the numbers?
I did not see the numbers. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I get triggered with DeSantis,
oh
but
no, I'm just
it's a
saying
me
what
thing.
he did. I mean, even forget about what he did in the last election. That was insane. Even when he barely squeaked by when he was running against Andrew Gillum,
yeah.
Did he have high
he
numbers
won
for
because
Black
of black
people?
men. Otherwise, he would have lost. And remember, and keep in mind, was one of the subtle beginnings of the turn. Usually it's a drip and it's multiple things. But keep in mind, if you remember that election, it's a white guy against a black guy, right? Everybody's pushing, making it race. And then in the debate, he said, stop monkeying around with stuff. And they tried to paint it that he called the guy a monkey. And he still got more black male votes than he got before. And he only won by like 2%. The last time he won by like 30 points. It wasn't even close. Like Marco Rubio won and DeSantis won Miami-Dade. No
Mhm.
Republican had won Miami-Dade in like decades, right? So
I have a question. Carlton, do you think, because I know you work or you worked in politics as like a, consultant or whatever. Do you think you can outrun your past and still have a political career? Or are you always going to kind of be like, they're going to bring up, oh, that guy that represents this candidate said these things. Do you think you can get past that?
I mean, I have done some political work since all of that. I mean, including with Congresswoman Nancy Mace down in South Carolina, whenever she was facing what was seen as the biggest political challenge of her life after she voted against Speaker McCarthy. But I mean, she is a personal friend, and I can sit here and say that a number of other candidates that I have offered to help showed up at their events. They have not turned me away or brought up the past on that one. So I will sit there and say that is it something that anybody can bring up at any time? Just Googling my name, yes. But at the same time, I have found that there is a big amount of grace out there, but also at the same time, whenever I'm committed to a candidate, I'm one who is like a pit bull and goes all in and just gives all of my energy. And like I said, not being immodest, I have worked for a number of high profile candidates and done good work for them. And so for me, it's okay. I've demonstrated that as far as the parts of those views that were wrong, I have I mean, in both word and deed and mindset, turned my back on them, but also whenever I show up to work and just try to get the people I believe in elected. And that's people like Congresswoman Mace, who I think is going to be a great governor of South Carolina come next year.
hmm.
Wow.
Percy, anything else you want to ask?
No, that was it
Was it?
as far as that goes.
What do you think of Carlton? Like I said earlier about Will and I kind of going back and forth about the not that they exist, but the strength of the as they're sometimes deemed woke right on the social media. What do you think about that? Do you think that that is because yours was different. I didn't expect your road to racism to be what it was. So do you think that that is is influencing a lot of young people, or do you think that's just people, throwing stuff out there for influence?
I would sit there and say that for me, a lot of it is that you see social media has magnified views that I think that were always there. I mean,
Hmm.
there are a number of people that you would just call influencers, like your Charlie Cooks of the world, who think it's cool to say what they said about black pilots and say what they said about Martin Luther King. But I would sit there and say that I mean they've always been there. They just have a microphone this time,
Hmm.
one that is amplified by social media, and so they might. I mean, they definitely can try to bring new people into the fold,
Hmm.
and like with me, those views that Pat Buchanan had that influenced me. I think that that does have a factor in terms of bringing up a new generation. I can't sit here and say that I think that there are more racists now than there were 30 years ago. But I can also sit there and say that the microphone for the ones that are out there is that much bigger.
Lou, anything from you?
No, it reminded me of I saw a clip that came across on X, it's like a few weeks back of Tucker Carlson from back in, I don't know if it was like the 90s, maybe early 2000s, and he was talking about Pat Buchanan and kind of talking about like Pat Buchanan sometimes walking that line, and where Tucker was like, I don't want to go with you over this line because you seem really close to it. He wasn't having a conversation with him. He was kind of monologuing about Pat Buchanan's work. But I think that is pretty interesting to check out. I mean, one thing I do want to say, when we on the subject of like uh, the complaints about like DEI, especially with airplanes, I think it's really important for Black people to start crashing some planes because it seems like only white people have been doing it.
They won't give
And
us enough controls.
I know, dude, it's real. It's not helping like all these memes that are going out because I'm like, all right, where's the DEI happening, in this? So
Lou, let me ask you this question. Since you talked about seeing that clip, has Tucker crossed the line now, 20 years later, that he said Pat was crossing? Because I know a
Yeah.
lot of people accuse him of it.
I mean, I honestly I don't follow Tucker enough
Mhm.
for that. I mean, I I see his like clips, come from here and there depending on who he's talking
I'm kind of
to.
like that.
But
I see more people talking about the fact that he's gone woke right than I actually
yeah,
hear what he says. But Chris,
yeah. I mean, the last thing I
anybody else has
remember,
any opinion on that?
yeah, the last thing I remember like watching a clip of him, I guess in like a Russian supermarket acting. Maybe
Oh
he
man, that
was,
was a while ago.
yeah,
Wow, they
maybe,
have shopping carts.
maybe he was, yeah, legitimately amazed by a supermarket. I'm like, well, this looks like any Vons or Key Food that I've been
They
in.
don't even have to lock them up.
Yeah.
I'll say for me, I do think Tucker's crossed the line. I mean, I'm one of those old school people who thought that, I mean, the Russians are still the bad guys, and they still act like it. So, I mean, he is definitely became a useful idiot, but I will definitely say, as far some of the Holocaust questioning and some of the narrative of the Holocaust questioning, I think that for me, I mean, I'm very ironically enough, for my past, I'm very sensitive on the issue of anti-Semitism. So I would sit there and say that in terms of the questioning of the narrative of the Holocaust, Tucker has definitely jumped the shark, much like Candace Owens and Kanye have.
So your racism was strictly to the blacks then?
I will sit there and say that I did have some attitudes about immigration when it came to Hispanics in the 2000s that I would sit there and say it was not as forefront of mind, but definitely it was not a benevolent place that I was coming from in terms of some of my some of my thinking about illegal immigration at the time.
Last words, Wilford Riley.
Yeah, no, I mean, as always, enjoyed the interview, enjoyed the panel. I mean, I do think there's one important point to make here about almost forgiveness, which is Carlton is something like the fifth guest we've had on this show that used to be either a right wing or left wing radical. And we've had about 10 years. I mean, Trayvon Martin was 2012, 15 years of the two sides going back and forth at each other to the point where you've literally had racial and political gun battles in the street, like Kenosha. So
Mhm.
at some point, we're going to have to say, enough of this doxing, enough of the idea that you can never recover from these things, from often quite mundane comments like James Damore. Women are better at verbal and men are better at math. There's a standard that I hold where I won't have an active bigot in my house for a dinner party or something that goes on right or left. You can't hate whites, you can't hate blacks. But if someone says, okay, I got too far over these lines, I was on the edge right for a while, I was a communist for a while, and now I'm a business person, you kind of have to say, okay, well now you're a taxpayer again. That's fine. And that's basically my reaction to this. I mean, I think the idea of how this happens, and I don't think it happens on just one political side, is interesting. Like you see what looks like active bigotry from the other team. You're not a punk, you respond to it. And there's now this whole internet world that's set up, even for like angry men and women. There are all these accounts like learn how to treat these sluts. And it's like you do have to stop people from falling off that cliff. But if people do and then they climb back in a year, I mean, you've got to kind of welcome them back. There's got to be a process where that happens.
Yeah,
That's
and
my
I'm not a fan of any cancellation, but I definitely have a problem when it's a long time. I mentioned, I just want to, it's even worse than I said. I said that it was 13 years ago when they were talking about Carlton's folks. It was 13 years ago in the article, but the article was written in January 23. So now we're talking about 15 years ago? Really? 15 years?
Pretty
It's,
much.
yeah.
I mean, I will sit there and say, I mean, I can't talk about the context of why those views became public, but I can also just sit there and say that, I mean, there's no bitterness on my part. I mean, if it means that I get to have conversations like this, and I mean, if I get the opportunity to hopefully I mean, show people that yes, you can come back from the edge, and that you don't just double down whenever you're wrong on something. You can just sit there and say, I mean, you can say I was wrong, find active ways to do right, and not wear kente cloths or whatever the equivalent
Thank
of
you.
from the communist side is. I don't know if like putting a Ronald Reagan statue up in your house is the equivalent of coming back from communism, but that's I mean, for me, that's the benefit of having conversations like this. I take away from those views coming out and coming public.
I don't know. I'm a little offended that you didn't come on the show wearing the kente cloth. Christy Kelly, what are your final words?
No, that's it. I mean, it's just great to see Carlton again. I wrote an article about him some while back, so it's great to have
About
this
him
conversation.
being not liking black people, or what was your article about?
No, it was actually about a case that he had against a certain figure of CPAC.
Oh, the dude was in
Um,
trouble again today. Oh, damn.
yes, yes. So if you guys haven't seen that, you might want to check that out. But Carlton teased the fact of the whole Pat Buchanan thing. And so I promised that we would have this race talk because I had questions and he definitely answered them. Especially and not in a cringe way. I mean, because I'm glad that you just naturally seek out black people and you're not like, oh, I gotta have a black best friend to make amends. I mean, I do have a nonprofit, so if you want to, donate to it,
It's
I'll
funny.
shoot you that
I,
EIN number.
Adopt a
But
black. There you go.
I, I don't know if y'all seen the clip. There was this Marianne Williamson event where basically she asked all the white people in the audience to find the nearest black person and lay hands upon them and say, "I apologize for the sins of slavery."
Marianne Williamson did that?
Yeah,
That's
and so
good.
my friend,
Oh, why did you? You know, she was on the show a few weeks ago. I wish I would have known. I would have asked her about that.
so my friend, one of my friends, he's the African American outreach director for the state Republican Party at the time, and so we had that clip up, just laughing at it. And the first thing I did was just laid hands upon him. I apologize for the sins of slavery, and he just lost that.
She did not do that. I won't believe it unless you send it to me. I don't believe
Google it; it is real.
it. Marianne, come on. You're better than that. Um, we appreciate the support though, but come on. Lou, last words from you.
No, I guess it was something that we were talking about earlier. It is interesting the conversations about, who are the true Americans. And I'm thinking about my dad's an immigrant. My mom is American, so does that make me kind of first generation? But then, it's funny seeing the people who are, having these arguments online. And Will's pointed out that a lot of the race shit, there's always some guy in like fucking Malaysia
Right.
who's trying to have it. But for the Americans here, it's like, oh, he's seeing dudes with like Italian last names, and I'm like, wait a minute, you guys weren't on the Mayflower, so the
Right.
idea that okay, real Americans, real white Americans start now,
Right.
at this specific place in order so that they can be included. I just find really, uh, I don't know, funny at this point. So
Yeah.
Yeah, like the idea just genetically that Italians are white in some magic way, but like Cubans or Mexicans or people from Spain aren't is utterly illogical. It's just one of
yeah,
those things people believe. And a lot of this goes back to the 1970s when we decided who got affirmative action, who didn't. Dave Bernstein wrote a book about this, like where they actually like people would sit down and almost play chess with each other and decide who was white, who wasn't. So like Egyptians are white. A lot of it doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. Isn't there a book when the Irish became black or something like that?
Irish became white. They'd been
I became white.
considered
That's what
kind
I
of
mean. When they
black.
became white. Yeah.
Yeah, the Irish were the serfs on plantations where the slaves were black. So the difference was that like Massa had to let him go eventually.
Right.
But like the general contract was 23 years and the life expectancy then was like 28.
Right.
So that's why a lot of black people are part Irish. But eventually the Irish stopped being considered like these recognizable, red-headed, tough-looking
Right.
Afro-American proxies, and they became white. And it was a long sequence.
Right, right. Well, I guess we have to leave it there. Carlson, thank you for coming on and not
Pleasure.
wearing the kente, although I would have liked it, but the rest of the group wouldn't have liked it. And I don't know. I'm not really convinced how. I mean, you need to come back and kind of sell me on just how racist. I think you're burying some of the racists because I'm like, what did you do? I made fun of a politician. No, come on. It had to be worse than that. But if that's all you did, I'm sorry you got canceled. But you can rise like a phoenix. And thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been a blessed time. I enjoyed it.
I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.